So we've done a lot of talking about plant-based proteins, and so I'm going to show you a really traditional way of making some beans that we could use either instead of or in addition to any sort of meat in tacos, so that you can really shift more toward high fiber, microbiome friendly protein sources. So to do this, we have a few ingredients. So I have a little bit of mellow bland oil. It could be a virgin olive oil or canola oil, vegetable oil, some minced garlic, plenty of minced garlic. Really important to have a lot of garlic here, unless you're not a fan, which I can't imagine. Then we have some Mexican oregano. There are different kinds of oregano, and so this will give it more of a Latin flavor. So you want to ideally not use the Turkish oregano, which will make it taste a little bit more like pizza sauce or pasta sauce. There's some cumin here, which again, you'll see that continue to resurface in our Latin flavors. We have some small diced green peppers, small diced onions, and then I have some pinto beans here. Pinto beans or Peruano beans are really traditional in terms of making this dish. You could use black beans, really any beans you like though. It's not limited to any specific kind. You could either take 2 cans and drain them, rinse them to get rid of the extra salt that tends to be in canned beans, or you could cook from scratch some beans, and we'll go over how to do that in a future session. But this would end up being 3 cups once they're cooked. So about 3 cups of beans, however you want to make that happen. And then you can either use water, which is perfectly fine. We're getting a lot of flavors from our spices. If you want to amp up the flavor a little bit more, you can use some stock, which we have here. I'm using vegetable stock to keep this vegetarian, so really anyone can have it, but you could certainly use chicken stock as well. And then we'll season at the end with a little bit of salt and pepper. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and heat up my pan. And so you want to use a medium heat, and you want to make sure, I've already pre-warmed my pan, but you want to make sure that your pan is warm. It shouldn't be so hot that your oil starts smoking, but it should kind of shimmer on top, and it's really only something you could see when you're looking at it. It's hard to show on video. All right, and then I'm going to add my garlic. And if it really starts sizzling, you want to turn it down. Garlic burns really easily. And burnt garlic is really bitter, and you're just going to have to start over if you do that. We're going to add our peppers and onions. And if your garlic starts to cook too fast, like mine was almost ready to cook too fast, then adding some other ingredients will help you to cool the pan. You can also just take it off the heat. So if you're wondering what I'm using here to cook, this is an induction burner. It heats by using magnets. If you're using gas or electric, that's also fine. But you want a nice sizzle to keep going. You're going to want to spend a couple of minutes just cooking these until they're nice and softened. And this action of sizzling things in oil in a pan in a single layer, keeping the heat up. This will come back to it, but this is actually sauté, which is a technique that we'll learn in the next session. If you want a really caramelized flavor, you can brown your onions a little bit. I feel like it adds, unless you're going to be doing this for a long time, it's going to add some bitterness, so better to just try and keep it from having too much browning in this unless you want to babysit it for a while. You can also add a pinch of salt at this point. It will help release some of the moisture from the vegetables. It seasons it and also helps it cook a little bit faster. And what we're aiming for is, we're going from having the white of the onions to having them where they're just starting to get almost like you imagine if it kept going, it would become see-through. They're a bit translucent. We're pretty much there, so I'm going to go ahead and add my spices now. So I'm adding the cumin and the oregano. And I always like to add my spices when the pan's warm here before I add my liquids. It just releases some of the oils, mainly from the spices, not so much from the oregano. So this is more important for the cumin here. This will also come up when we're, cooking in other flavor traditions as well in the course. All right, now I'm going to add my beans and the stock. And so I'm adding just a little bit of the stock first, and then any little bits that are stuck to the pan, that's going to release that from the pan. It's called deglazing. If you just dumped it all in there, everything that was stuck to the bottom of the pan would just stay stuck to the bottom of the pan, and you'd be, scraping while you cook. So that loosened everything up. And all those little bits, as long as they're not burnt, which are hopefully avoided, are going to add a lot of flavor to the dish as well. So now I'll add the rest of the liquid. And then, everything is pre-cooked at this point. So, if you're in a hurry, you could always stop and serve this, but I really recommend to have the flavors meld, to simmer this, which is just like a gentle bubble, which I'll get it up to a simmer so you can see. And simmer it for about 10 minutes. You want to stir occasionally. There are some of the carbohydrate in the onions and bean will start to stick to the bottom of the pan if your heat's too high or you leave it the whole time. So let's... Okay, and we're just about at a simmer now, so there's some bubbles here. We want it to be just a little bit more bubbly, and then we're pretty much where we want it to be. Whenever you're simmering something, if you want to be able to step away for a second, you want to get it up as high, as high a heat, as much bubbling as you want, and then turn the temperature down so that you see it start to recede a little bit. That's how you know that it's not going to continue to, boil and boil over in your pan. And then you may have to come back and adjust. You can imagine as some of the liquid boils off, then, it might, that whatever heat you have might effectively be hotter. So you want to not leave it for too long. Remember, if you cover anything with a lid, that moisture is not going to evaporate. So if you want it to be more thicker, less soupy, you want to keep the lid off. All right, so we're getting about to where we want this to be with, you can see that the liquid's evaporated, might be starting to stick a little bit, but it's easy to scrape up. The sauce is a lot thicker. The spices and herbs have had a chance to hydrate and release their flavors into the dish. And if you wanted to have whole beans, you season and you're done. If you want this to be more of a refried beans mashed up, you could get a potato masher or fork and mush this up a little bit. If you do that, you probably want to have a little bit of extra stock on hand because it usually requires adding more. Otherwise, it really gets very thick and pasty if you're going to do that. But we're all set here. So I'm just going to season with salt and go ahead and turn off. There. I wish you could smell this on the video. It smells so delicious. A little bit of salt. If you use canned beans, if they weren't sodium free, which most of them aren't, even if you've rinsed off a lot of that liquid, which is where a lot of the salt is, they do absorb some salt, so you're probably not going to really have to add any, if anything, to this. If they're home cooked and you didn't cook them with salt, you're going to need to add more. And if you make it the day before and then go to eat it later, then the beans actually tend to absorb salt over time, so you may need to re-season it again when you go to serve it. I'll take my tasting spoon here. You could also add, if you wanted to, you could add a little lime to the beans as well, but we're going to have that kick of lime from our salsa when we eat this. So. Really good. The other thing that you want to make sure is you've kind of cooked the crunch out of the peppers. So there's just a tiny bit of crunch left. I might, simmer it, maybe put a little bit more stock and cook it just for another minute or two, but pretty close. And I use the pinto beans, but again, pick the beans of your choice. It's a really delicious way to have a really tasty, flavorful, plant-based, protein-rich dish. We're going to serve this in some tacos. And if you want to do this but don't have quite this amount of time, in the recipes there's actually another great, super quick way to do this where you can literally open a can of beans. I'd highly encourage you to get low sodium for that because you're not dumping off the liquid. It works best, I would say, with black beans. But you can just sprinkle some cumin, some garlic powder, salt in there, microwave it until it's warm and bubbling, stir it, and it's actually ready to go. There's no quicker way to get a protein on your plate. It's super, super healthy. So 2 different ways, the regular way and the super quick Latin style beans recipe.